what do you now believe the task of philosophy to be?
Philosophical puzzles arise because we tend to mix up one language game with another. For example, people puzzle over the nature of something they call the soul. But this may just be because they're thinking of the soul along the lines of a physical object. They're confusing one way of talking with another.
The job of philosophy is to sort out these language games?
Exactly. Well, they're all perfectly in order as they are. Philosophy in no sense can question them. Philosophy leaves everything exactly as it is.
Professor Wittgenstein, you've been associated with the argument that there can't be a private language. Could you explain this a little?
What I mean is this. We learn to use words because we belong to a culture, a form of life, a practical way of doing things. In the end, we speak as we do because of what we do. And all this is a public affair. Philosophers in the tradition of Descartes start from the lonely self, brooding over its private sensations. I want to overturn this centuries-old model. I want to start from our culture, our shared practical life together, and look at what we think and feel and say in these public terms.
Professor, thank you very much.
So those are just three brief segments from the movie, and of course the movie doesn't really give you a full grasp of the various complexities of his two main language analysis philosophies. The first one that goes associated with the Tractatus is also associated with Bertrand Russell's logical atomism. So logical atomism, Bertrand Russell basically argues that the language is meaningful as we use it because parts of the words and the sentences have atomic relationships to the objects in the situation that we're talking to. And so just as we have everything in our situation arranged, the language arranges those objects, the relationships the words have to those objects, and that the camera is sitting on the table, in a sense, that statement would be true because all the parts of that statement literally are associated with the actual situation. I mean, you could get into whole courses about all of this stuff. Fascinating stuff, but that's of course not something we can really delve into unless you take a seminar or something on that sort of thing. But there's all kinds of famous things associated with that, quite interesting. But it was the logical atomism that he thought of as the picture theory of meaning, where the language pictures the situation, and that there's this relationship between the parts of the statements and the things in the room, and that's the universal way that language works. And I think I mentioned last class that really traces itself all the way back to St. Augustine, talking about the beginnings of language. So that's fairly old, but it's after his experience teaching, based on the philosophy of John Dewey, that he becomes familiar with the Hegelian way of looking at things, and because of that evolution and the organic model, you don't have this one-to-one correspondence that you would in this atomic, logical atomism. So instead, what you have are language games. And language games isn't like Scrabble or Pictology or whatever, those kind of, but instead, this is just his way of talking about the way language is used in various situations, which he called forms of life, and that's not new with him. Lebensformen is a German expression that goes through lots of other philosophers, all the way back to, there's a philosopher that I never mentioned who was an associate of Hegel and Goethe, and at the moment, Herder, Gottlob Herder. I think it's Gottlob. Gottlieb Herder. Gottfried, sorry. So he's a pretty interesting philosopher too. We never really discussed him at all, but he's got lots of interesting stuff associated with that same period. Remember, it's not just the philosophers we highlight, but we're looking at kind of a cultural movement. There's lots of individuals, some, of course, not as important. Music, you might talk about Bach, you might talk about Mozart, you might not talk about Salieri, and yet Salieri was very important. He was Beethoven's teacher, for one thing. In any case, so the second philosophy that Wittgenstein is credited with starting is ordinary language analysis, and that's associated with the Philosophical Investigations, which is the second of the two texts that we have in our text on Wittgenstein. Excerpts again. There's stuff about the way he writes that shows he's, I think, autistic, which is kind of interesting. There's all sorts of things about that. But so ordinary language analysis, the philosophy of language we get from him, basically is structured by saying that there's a form of life within which we speak a particular language in a language game that's associated with that form of life, and we have to follow certain grammar rules in using the language in that particular form of life. And by the way, it might change in other forms of life. We might even have the same utterance, so we might, say other things. So, for example, if I'm shopping in a supermarket, there's words that I use in that particular environment that are very specific to that environment. These oranges are on sale, right? Well, the oranges right next to it, they're on sale too, but they're not on sale, right? I mean, there's a peculiar thing, about the way we use the language in that, and there's things I could say in a supermarket that I certainly couldn't say in a hospital. So if I go into the hospital and go up to the information desk and ask, are you going to have a special on heart attacks anytime soon? Because I'm thinking of having one, but I want to wait until they're on special. I mean, we don't talk that way in a hospital. The language game is different, and so on. And what he said in the video that philosophical questions arise when we mix our language games, and that's because we're confused, because we're thinking the meaning of the word ought to be the same, but the thing is, in different contexts, the word can mean quite different things. So philosophy in that sense is therapeutic, because it goes in and it breaks the games apart so that you realize, oh, well, the reason why I was confused is because I was thinking this way, but it should have been, understood as this way and this way, and that's why I was confused, etc. It's almost like, if you're playing a game like soccer or something, and people show up with a basketball and want to do hoops and stuff, right? No, you can't play soccer and basketball both at the same time, right? What's wrong with this picture, right? In a way, that's what gives rise to philosophical problems. So in a sense, I think that's why in the movie he says, philosophy doesn't change anything, it leaves everything just the way it is, but it sorts out these puzzles that we have so that we now understand how all that stuff works, right? But everything kind of evolves to be in its own form of life, and it's perfectly fine that way. I mean, the way the supermarket works is excellent, right? As they change, because they develop different things, of course the vocabulary will change and so on, but we don't want to mess with it. So lots of stuff associated with Wittgenstein. Still very, very important. They're still coming up with wonderful things about Wittgenstein. Although, just sort of a warning, if you see books in a bookstore on sale, Ludwig Wittgenstein on mathematics, on religion, etc. He didn't publish books on mathematics or on religion, etc. What people are doing are going into his writings and taking out excerpts that are all associated with mathematics and then publishing a book saying this is Wittgenstein on math, right? So it's not like he published anything other than really the Tractatus. He didn't even publish the Philosophical Investigations. That was post mortem. The same thing with the blue and brown books, which were his notes that he was writing. And the one was a blue book and the other one was a brown book, so blue and brown, etc. So there's lots of Wittgenstein books out there, but they came from the way individuals go through the notes on those. If you're interested, I think a great summer read is Ray Monk's book, Wittgenstein, The Duty of Genius. It's one of those philosophical biographies that gives you the life of the person, but ties it in very closely to what philosophically was happening in that milieu. So it's not just Wittgenstein's philosophy, but others, so that you get a good sense of why the things arose the way they did and everything. Very good history that way. In fact, that works really well in moving into the four philosophers that I wanted to touch on today. Because these four, Isaiah Berlin, Charles Taylor, Francis Fukuyama, and Michael Ignatieff, are basically doing intellectual history. So when we think about the way Hegel's change in our overall picture of things and our sense of what knowledge is, history becomes a very important part of it. That was certainly part of what Hegel did. Hegel famously wrote a history of philosophy, which I believe was fairly new. I don't think anyone else had done that. He also wrote a philosophy of history. And that's kind of interesting because historicism as a mode of thinking really begins with this. I mean, obviously there was history before, but thinking of our social, our societies evolving, the sociality of knowledge essentially evolving, meant that you had to pay a lot more attention to the way history evolved. And that's how you would understand why people think the way they do. So it's really our expression, you have to walk a mile in somebody's moccasins to know what they're thinking, right? You have to get a sense of who the person is before you can understand them. Well, the same thing with literature. Why did Goethe write the way he did? Why did Edgar Allan Poe write the way he did, etc.? In order to really understand them, Dickens, etc. I mean, we want to put them in their cultural milieu and understand them from that perspective. That's actually historicism. That's a new thing that begins with Hegel. So Isaiah Berlin does that. So I mean, Hegel has the idea and does some of that in his various books, but doesn't delve into it too much. But Isaiah Berlin does that as a profession, trying to understand why things came about by detailed analysis of how the various authors, the literature, influenced the different people. So you're not just looking at philosophy and how it changed, you're looking at philosophers in the context of their literary culture, their whole society, and that involves politics, it involves the arts, it involves philosophy, science, all those developments. And so what you're looking at from this point on is not just philosophical positions and how they've changed, but you're looking at the entire culture and why it's changing the way it does, right? And so Isaiah Berlin influences both Charles Taylor and Michael Ignatieff. Charles Taylor was a student of his, I believe. Michael Ignatieff is Canadian, as Charles Taylor is, by the way. But Michael Ignatieff, we also see being influenced by Isaiah Berlin because he becomes a real fan and an interviewer and a biographer. So when you want a good biography of Isaiah Berlin, Michael Ignatieff's book on Berlin is an excellent choice. For one thing, it's relatively small, but at the same time, really covers some interesting points. And we could also go and look at Ignatieff interview with Berlin. And this was before, of course, Berlin died.
1995.
It's hard to interview someone
and in
once
accordance
they're
with the
dead.
philosopher's wishes, they're being shown only now, after his death last week.
But he wasn't allowed to publish his book or publish the interview until after